magician summons skull.
Over the course of the original Yu-Gi-Oh! Duel Monsters anime, Yugi Muto, the king of games, faces off against many powerful foes.
One of my favorite shows of all time, and that being Yu-Gi-Oh! Why Yugi's deck makes no sense. And it does make a lot of sense because, especially in early Yu-Gi-Oh!, the whole idea of like archetypal decks was only something really introduced as part of GX. But OG, it was always like just throw in your best monsters and see what happens. With Yugi's deck being one of the worst offenders in terms of the sheer number of different decks matched up together to form his actual deck. And it really wasn't for the heart of the cards. Yeah, he had no chance. But this is anime. Things don't always have to make sense. Because at the end of the day, if a character needs to win, they'll win. And it's simple as that. But let's get straight to the video. The magician summons skull.
Over the course of the original Yu-Gi-Oh! Duel Monsters anime, Yugi Muto, the king of games, faces off against many powerful foes, and time again is shown to be the most powerful duelist in the world of Yu-Gi-Oh! And through his various iconic battles, Yugi has regularly shown why he's the best of the best, and with every great duelist lies an iconic deck, which Yugi uses several of, such as his Grandpa's deck when facing down Kaiba and his three powerful Blue Eyes White Dragons, or his well-renowned Battle City deck, which contains the three Almighty God cards. As a casual viewer, you might get the impression that Yugi's deck was the best in the entire show, and if you were to copy his deck and fill it with Dark Magician, Slifer the Sky Dragon, and Exodia, you could achieve similar success. So I thought it might be a fun exercise to examine which of Yugi's deck was him at his peak, through the lens of a more realistic approach.
The best deck was definitely, I would say,
So to start off, we have Yugi's first deck.
If I was to guess my interpretation of his best deck in terms of like make it into a real life deck would definitely be his Waking Dragons deck. That deck was so powerful, especially with the new Eye of Tamai supports. If you are like TCG player or OCG player, the Waking Dragons deck is definitely his best because it's his Battle City deck more refined, subtracted the dead cards such as the 3 Egyptian gods. Like they're powerful, but they're also bricks, so they don't really translate well into real life. So for me, yeah, the Waking Dragons deck is his best, but let's see what the story and this author has to say.
Which, we only see Black Clan Fire Dragon. Yeah, not much to go off of here. Now we have Grandpa's deck, which we only see Yugi using twice. First in a duel against Kaiba, and the second being the Shadow Game duel against Pegasus. Given that the deck is only present for 2 duels, there isn't much to gleam over, but from what we do see, his Grandpa's deck contains mainly monster cards, with the only 2 effect monsters being Sangan and a main piece of Exodia, with only 2 spell cards, or magic cards at the time, contained in his deck. As you can see, this deck is pretty unga bunga, with the main premise just hoping that you have a higher attack monster. Of course, that's to be expected given that at this point in anime, duel monsters as a concept was not fleshed out. The presence of Exodia, however, is probably the most interesting aspect of the deck. In the context of the first duel anime, it serves as a cool plot device which allows Yugi to turn the ropes on Kaiba to allow
Quick question though, in terms of iconic anime moments, where would we put Exodia Obliterate? Because, not gonna lie, in terms of sheer iconic moments, may very well be top 10, maybe top 3. Like, I'll be surprised if any anime watcher like has not seen or at least know of the Exodia Obliterate moment. But I'd love to hear your thoughts. Name me any more iconic anime moments that are better and more known than Exodia Obliterate, and we'll hear your comments down below.
Value to the deck, it falls in that aspect. We know that his Grandpa's deck contained only 40 cards, so at least that streamlined the win condition of Exodia. However, in some ways, the higher chance of drawing Exodia might actually have been a detriment. The win conditions for Exodia state that you need all 5 pieces in your hand, which means that you need to run all 5 monsters, which individually are awful given their poor stats, and so would take up the place of any other monsters that could actually beat over any other monsters. You would effectively be drawing into dead cards that serve no other purpose than being fodderized by literally any monster, until you get all 5, which would
to say about Exodia is that Exodia as a deck in terms of the first season is actually so powerful because you have to remember, in the first Duelist Kingdom arc, they can't attack directly, nor can nor can you attack. So firstly, you can't attack directly, which makes it so powerful in an event that all you ever need is to summon at least one monster and survive, which makes it so good. So stalling tactics is so much easier. And you have to also remember, this is a time where cards like Swords of Virulent Light is a thing, Sangan can search your pieces, Witch of the Black Forest can search out your pieces, you got draw cards like Graceful Charity, Pots of Greed. Like, it's a very, very powerful deck if you were to use it for the Duelist Kingdom rules. And it doesn't make sense. Weevil had to get rid of it because it would just be too powerful. Adding Heart of the Cards, yeah, it'll be a wash for everyone there.
Quite rare. Obviously, you aren't running Exodia for their stats, but instant win condition. So how reliable is this? Well, just like duel monsters, we can use another archaic method of solving problems that has existed since Egypt. Math. Through some magical trickery, we get the chance of drawing Exodia if we draw 5 cards in a 40 card deck.
Magic attack.
0.000151974%, or once per 658,000 duels. Not the best odds. But we still have the chance of drawing Exodia with each turn, right? Well, unfortunately, for a large number of turns, until your 17th turn, the odds of drawing all 5 pieces reach 1%. Unless, of course, the duel hasn't ended yet, or because you have 3 pieces of Exodia in your hand, clogging up any chance of making a play. It's only until 26 cards now have been drawn that you reach 10% of having all 5 pieces. Now, with the way Exodia decks worked in real TCG, a lot of deck thinners would be used to reach Exodia faster. Like using Royal Magical Library Spell Swap. In Grandpa's deck, from what we know, there's only Sangan and Swords of Revealing Light to have the cheapest goal, with the rest of the deck functioning as a normal deck. So is Exodia good if you're an anime protagonist with the power of plot and weirdly shaped hair? Yes. If you're just an average guy, not so much. 0 out of 10. From what little we are shown, the deck is really awful. It's mainly comprised of normal monsters, with at best mediocre attack, with spells that again are pretty bad, and contains Exodia, which mathematically is going to be useless most of the time. So not anime isn't exactly clear whether or not the deck Yugi uses throughout Duel's Kingdom is solely his grandpa's deck, or a combination of his own and his grandpa's. The only possible clues we get are from a manga where Yugi is shown combining his and his grandpa's deck to use in preparation for Duel's Kingdom. So we will assume that from onwards where Weevil throws away Exodia, off-screen Yugi modifies his grandpa's deck to include cards from his own deck. As we can see with this deck, we can actually see a lot more utility in the form of the increased spell and trap lineup. But that still doesn't make for the lack of monster quality. We still have the usual normal monster junk and are still very mediocre, with the highest normal summonable monster only being 1500. As you can see, you'll probably have a hard time beating over many monsters with the basic lineup of monsters we have. If push comes to shove and you'll need to turtle up, you do have some surprisingly good defensive options, with Mystical Elf and Giant Soldier of Stone possessing a nice 2000 defense, which will probably will given how awful the deck is.
Which is actually very
So what about the
strong
level 5 and higher monsters?
Well,
again, the monster lineup isn't much to talk about. We again have Dark Magician and Guy from Grandpa's deck, which for 2 tributes is still awful given the low payoff you receive. With the only good monsters being Summoned Skull with a beastly 2500 attack points for only a single tribute summon, making it the best monster in the deck, despite what the anime wants you to believe. There is also the addition of new exciting powerful ritual monsters in the form of Black Cluster Soldier and Magician of Black Chaos. These cards boast an impressive attack of 3000 and 2800, which are the highest in Yugi's deck today, so in theory they should be great additions, right? Well, to let me fully explain this, let me give a quick crash course in card advantage. Card advantage is the premise that simply, if you have more cards than your opponent, you're more likely to have an edge, which is pretty simple enough to understand. And this idea is pretty intuitive. Take for example, if a player has 7 cards on their hand and field, and an opponent only has 3 cards in their hand and field, so obviously the player with more cards is more likely to win. Now if we extrapolate this idea out to a card like Pot of Greed, many players would say this gives a +1 in card advantage, as you lose 1 spell,
probably the
Pot of Greed,
strongest
but you
card
draw
in the
2 new
game.
cards, hence the +1. So for example, if we were to ritual summon Black Cluster Soldier, we require Black Cluster Soldier, Black Cluster Ritual, and 2 monsters where their levels combine to be level 8. If we look at this in terms of card advantage, we are discarding 2 monsters, a spell, to summon 1 ritual monster, which is a -3 in card advantage for 3000 beta. So not only do ritual monsters require a huge loss in card advantage, this essentially means they are detriments to the consistency of your deck. As if you only lack the ritual spell, but have the ritual monster, or vice versa, you're left with an unusable card. We also see a relatively more impressive arsenal of spells and traps in the arc, which is surprising given the quality of the monsters. But that's not to say every spell is a hit. Book of Secret Arts and Full Moon only give 300 extra stats to both defense and attack, to spellcasters and beasts respectively, which is a pretty lacking upgrade in power. But you'd also have to consider that Yugi only runs 3 beasts and 2 spellcasters in his deck, meaning that these cards are pretty much useless for the majority of the duel. We also have cards like Burning Land which destroy both field spells, so it's dead if your opponent doesn't have a field spell.
When you really see it broken down like this, it just goes to show how bad Yugi's deck is the first season of Yu-Gi-Oh! Like, it literally makes no sense, and cards are so hyper-specific that it's almost just, it's just the advantage and reason to put them in a deck far, like, are overshadowed by the disadvantages and the potential dead draws you can have. Like, yeah, like, without half the cards, Yugi was so done for. I'll even argue that, just based on how it looks like, Joey's deck might be slightly better, but maybe we have to do a different video of that. But it does make sense why Kaiba was by far the strongest duelist. Like, he literally has a 3,000 attack points, which is like the strongest for this time. I think even in the show, it only stated that Perfectly Ultimate Great Moth and Gate Guardian were the only cards canonically which were stronger than Blue Eyes in terms of the main monster deck. So yeah, really goes to show a lot of how Yugi really got lucky, didn't he? But he's still the GOAT, king of games.
Which is probably all the time. Breath of Light, which destroys all rocks, so useless against literally every deck. Or Maxu the Magical Mist, which only boosts Summon Skull's attack. Thankfully, we do see some powerful cards that are used, and arguably are quite broken in comparison to the rest of the deck.
Mirror Force.
Which is Mirror Force, Dark Hole, Brain Control, and Monster Reborn. With Monster Reborn, Yugi now has access to the revival of any monster from
Interesting how all four of them were
now when any powerful monster
banned.
such as Dark Magician or Blue Eyes is sent to the grave, he has access to
were.
resummon them to his field. Which is quite powerful given that you can use it as either a way to advance his board state after the destruction of an enemy boss monster, or use it as a crucial sacrifice for a more powerful monster, which helps immensely with how special summoning becomes few and far between during this era of Yu-Gi-Oh! Dark Hole and Mirror Force serve as great match removal of any troublesome monsters, or multiple monsters that cannot be ran over with attacking. Not only that, but they can heavily punish overextending of the opponent's field. If you use Dark Hole on an opponent's board full of monsters, this may leave the opponent with no strong monsters in their hand if they're unlucky. Brain Control not only comes as another form of, but also allows you to gain possession of the monster, which could quite literally, single-handedly win a game based on how powerful the card is. So how good is this deck? Well, honestly, even with the presence of a more varied and powerful spell and trap lineup, the deck is still incredibly weak in comparison to later decks. There's just too little offensive power, which is always a bad thing where it seems the main strategy is through beatdown. Although the deck possesses some incredibly strong staple cards, such as Brain Control or Dark Hole, they're still the only real strong points of the deck. These highlights aren't enough to carry the power level of the deck any higher. The deck is still incredibly weak and lacks any sort of clear win condition apart from Dark Magician or Summon Skull. 0.5 out of 10.
Dark Magician girl. Onward to Battle City. Probably his most iconic deck.
As the anime transitions to the Battle City arc, the rules of duel monsters in the show follows a lot more closely to the rules of the TCG. So with this change, we also see a change in Yugi's deck composition, with a lot more effect monsters, and a better balance between monsters, spells, and traps. So to start off, for the monster lineup, we have the Magnet Warriors, Alpha, Beta, and Gamma. These cards all have okay stat lines for the anime, with Alpha having the highest with a stat line of 1700 attack. There really is nothing special about them, as they're just vanilla beat sticks. But the most interesting thing about them is their boss monster, Valkyrion the Magna Warrior. At the surface, Valkyrion seems like a very powerful monster. It boasts some of the highest stats in the original Yu-Gi-Oh! Anime, let alone Yugi's deck, with a beastly 3500 attack points and 3850 defense. However, once you get past the cool numbers, you realize that the card is insanely janky, even for the anime. The summoning conditions required for Alpha, Beta, and Gamma to be either on your field or in your hand, which means that if you do not have these 3 specific cards in your hand, or field, you are left with an unusable card. Essentially, the power of the card in no way makes up for the heavily restrictive summoning conditions. And more often than not, the card is unusable. We also see
But it's so
dual
much better
with Giselle,
if it
King of
just made
Mythical
a
Beasts, and
fusion
Perfect.
monster.
Again, their stats aren't very impressive, but this time, Baphomet actually has a search effect for only Gazelle. The main gimmick being that you can fuse them together for a 2100 attack fusion monster. Yeah, as you can see, searching out another average stat vanilla monster is quite a mediocre effect, especially when you need a tribute, and the end result isn't exactly glamorous. The inclusion of these cards would be somewhat redeemable, if both monsters had the search effect of searching the other. Making a fusion summon only require polymerization and either monster. Just like ritual summoning, however, we have a similar problem, with the fusion summon itself being a -2, and requiring 3 specific cards, which makes the summon and the deck itself a lot more inconsistent. As it stands, the effort to summon a 2100 attack monster, with a pretty bad floating effect, is too inconsistent, and not really worth being in the deck. As for other notable mentions, we have Buster
only
Blader,
had maybe
a
like
2600
attack.
monster, which actually comes out ahead of Dark Magician, Yugi's ace, and is just straight up better, as it also has the extra 500 boost for every dragon in the graveyard, which given how popular dragons are in the show, the card's effect actually can come into play a considerable amount of times. So why does Buster Blader barely have any appearances, and Dark Magician is used more often? Well, ignoring the meta reason for Dark Magician being Yugi's signature ace, there actually is somewhat of an explanation. Given that in the show, Arcana explains that Dark Magician actually has a lot of support cards, like Dark Magical Curtain, Magical Hats, and Mystic Bugs, which the cards by themselves aren't actually awful. This does, however, tie into another problem with the deck, which I'll get into later. Talking about Dark Magician and Buster Blader, we actually have for once a powerful fusion monster, that even by early Yu-Gi-Oh standards is quite broken. Dark Paladin is a fusion between Dark Magician and Buster Blader with a great 2900 stat, which isn't really the strength of the card. What makes the card so potent is Dark Paladin's effect, which allows the player to negate any spell at the cost of discarding a card. This brings her a pretty rare form of disruption that you don't see in early Yu-Gi-Oh, let alone the anime,
Very,
and
very
negates
true.
was
Like, there's so few cards in early Yu-Gi-Oh where there's any sort of like negation and special summoning. This is very, very rare for the first season, or in the first iteration of Yu-Gi-Oh, which makes Dark Paladin so powerful. I personally would have liked it if at base he was stronger than Blue Eyes, so maybe give him like 31 to 3400 attack points. I think that would have been perfect to really solidify Dark Paladin as like that one step above Dark Magician and Buster Blader in order to really distinguish itself as one of his truest powerful monsters. But still very powerful card, and doesn't get nearly enough appearances. From what I can remember, he only has like 2 appearances. One in the duel against Kaiba, one in the, which is non-canon, in his first duel against the Society of Light, no, Seal of Orichalcus member, when he's against when he's adversing against Obelisk, and maybe one other moment I'm missing, but let me know in the comments below if I've missed any moments.
arguably the most broken card type in the show. So for once, we have a really strong card, and it's also a heavy hitter in the deck. So what's the problem with it? Well, like you'll hear me repeating many times throughout the video, it's the consistency of getting Dark Paladin out. Don't get me wrong, if you look at the card in a vacuum and imagine it on the field, it's great. But the problem always circles back to how rarely Dark Paladin would be able to get onto the field. As mentioned before, with fusion summoning, you really need to have a Dark Magician, Buster Blader, and Polymerization in your hand or field. So if you only have one copy of each card, the odds of pulling a fusion summon off are pretty rare. As for defensive options, we also get introduced to Big Shield Guardna, which provides a whopping 2600 defense points, the best
Very
defense
good.
for a normal summon monster in the original anime, at a cost of it being forced to change to attack position after being attacked. Despite this downside, the card is actually quite good, as it can be used for a first turn defensive wall, and later used as tribute fodder. And honestly, the biggest mistake Yugi makes in the show with this card is that he doesn't set it in face down defense position, for the free life point damage. Electromagnetic Turtle and Obnoxious Celtic Guardians
True,
are also great defensive
but
options.
to be honest though, I
With
believe they did
electromagnetic
say that, especially in the anime, they wanted cards to be shown physically, so that's why there's very few setting of cards, and why the ability to summon cards face up attack position is more face up defense position is always done. It's just purely so it's more interesting to watch as a viewer's perspective, which I can appreciate the show for doing, to be fair.
Turtle ending the battle phase, which can be great if you're looking to build up to one of the level 7 or 8 monsters of the deck, or just providing general battle protection. And Celtic Guardian has battle protection for monsters over and including 1900
Obnoxious.
attack. And this itself is pretty great for the anime,
Celtic
giving some
Guardian.
sort of battle protection from high attack monsters, and again,
Is
allowing to be
Celtic
tribute
Guardian or
fodder for the
Celtic
powerful
Guardian?
monsters of the deck. As the usual pattern goes, we have another level of power creep for the spells in Yugi's deck. Again, we have the usual staple cards that were already introduced, such as Monster Reborn or Brain Control. But now, with the way the anime progressed, cards would become used up a lot more often, and so there was a narrative need for the characters in the show to have more access to more cards in their hand after using them up. So turns wouldn't involve just playing a monster and passing. Because of this, we ended up getting introduced to some insanely broken draw cards, many of which are present in Yugi's deck. Cards like Pot of Greed, Graceful Charity give insane consistency to the deck, which badly needs it. But the most broken card of all is probably Card of Sanctity, which allows you and your opponent to draw up to
Very
6 cards in your
powerful.
hand. I probably shouldn't have to explain why this is absurdly broken, but if this wasn't powerful enough, you could also factor into the idea that you can choose when it goes off, so you can potentially use up the cards in your hand on your first turn, then redraw everything, going +5. Double Spell also has another downright broken effect, with the anime effect being that you can select as many cards as you want out of the opponent's graveyard. That was activated in the last turn, so let's say if Kaiba decides to use a Pot of Greed into a card of the Mize, you'd go +6. Obviously this is a best case scenario, and it's probably a bit less useful against modern Yu-Gi-Oh decks, where many spells are archetype specific, but during this period of Yu-Gi-Oh in the anime and the TCG, many spells were generic, and could be used for almost any deck. And there are even a couple of pretty decent spells introduced as well, like Soul Taker, providing some much needed easy monster removal, or Change of Hearts, which is just a better brain control. Despite the highlight of these new cards, the main problem of the deck is a problem carried over from Duelist Kingdom, and will be for most of the remaining decks, which is the inclusion of spell cards that are extremely niche or rely solely on the presence of Dark Magician. Cards like Ragnarok, Diffusion Wave Motion, Magical Hats, and Magical Formula are all highly conditional in that you require Spellcaster or Dark Magician on your field to activate.
To be fair, let me just go back to these cards. To be fair,
or rely solely on the presence of Dark Magician. Cards like Ragnarok, Diffusion Wave Motion, Magical Hats.
I'm not gonna lie, just talking about Ragnarok and Diffusion Wave Motion, so powerful cards. Because naturally, Diffusion Wave Motion is a card what he uses to defeat Kaiba in the semi-final, and then Ragnarok is the card he uses to defeat Marek and the Egyptian god Ra, the Winged Dragon of Ra. Very, very powerful. Like, even just read it. Like, remove from play all monsters from the hand. Remove from play all monsters from your hand, deck, and graveyard. Destroy and remove from play all cards your opponent controls. That's powerful. And you have to really think about it. Removing from play, now called banishing, was very, very powerful. There's only like 2 cards. Like, there's only a handful of cards, maybe like 3, but can even interact with cards and bring them back from the remove from play pile. Very powerful. And the Fusion Wave Motion, attacking every monster once. Very, very powerful. Very powerful. So, I would say...
Magical Formula are all highly conditional.
So I would say...
in that you require Spellcaster.
And to be fair, I'll definitely say it's like, Yugi definitely did play these cards during the main stage of the Battle City. He's 100% side decked these cards into the show, into the final battles, because he thinks he will need them. So I do feel like it's a bit of unfair to judge this card in the series the entire time, because how I interpret it is that Yugi, knowing he was facing Kaiba, and knowing Kaiba loves playing so multiple Blue Eyes White Dragons, this was a plan from him in order to counter this. And then naturally, he's seeing Ra in action, so he needs that extra balance breaking overpowered effect in order to counter it. But this is not more of a bad deck construction. This is more of like good side decking, knowing the kind of opponents he's facing and the kind of strategy he wants to use to defeat them. So this is great duelist ability, in my opinion. But maybe I'm just talking ass. Do you think this was an ass pull, or is it good side decking?
Or Dark Magician on your field to activate. Now, some of their effects themselves aren't that awful for the power level of the anime, such as Diffusion Wave Motion, which can attack every monster and also negate monster effects, certainly makes Dark Magician an OTK threat. The issue is that out of the 26 monsters we see in Yugi's deck in Battle City, only 2 are spellcasters, Dark Magician and Dark Magician Girl. And even worse is that they require tribute. This makes Yugi's deck even more of a brickfest than it already was. And this isn't even the worst of Yugi's deck choices. A lot of them are heavily situational and are useless in the majority of cases, unless you're the writer for a kids cartoon and need a heavily specific card to progress a duel, like Exile the Wicked, which is great if you're against the Fiend deck, and literally useless everywhere else. The fusion only works against fusion monsters, so useless for the majority of a duel. Polymerization, which Yugi's deck only runs Chimera and Dark Paladin, so again useless until you get exactly 2 cards in your hand that you need. But if you really want to see the worst of the spells that are actually just bad and downright hurt your deck, we have Spell Textbook and Ragnarok. Spell Textbook is a quick play spell, which allows you to discard your entire hand and draw 1 card. And if it is a spell, you can play it immediately. So ignoring how in pretty much most cases you would have to go minus to activate this card, and how card destruction is pretty much just a better version of this, we can analyze how it may be used. The best case scenario is that you can pull off a surprise spell on your opponent's turn, at the cost of discarding your entire hand. Even worse, if we look at the card from a more realistic angle, and even ignore the fact that most of the spells serve no real extra benefit to being activated on your opponent's turn. We also have the fact that more often than not, you would be drawing into monsters or traps. So yeah, this card is pretty much useless. Now for me personally, this card is probably the worst offender for an anime Aspal card. Ragnarok is a quick play spell card, which can only be activated if 2 magician cards are on the field, and if you meet the requirements, you get to destroy all monsters your opponent controls, at the cost of banishing all monsters in your deck, hand, and grave. Now there's quite a lot to unpack here. To start off, the condition is insanely hard to achieve, given 1. You require 2 specific cards that you only run 1 of in a deck, Dark Magician Girl and Dark Magician. And 2. The act of summoning those monsters is not exactly an easy feat. With how few cards support special summoning in the deck, more often than not, you'll need to tribute summon them out. which is pretty slow and prone to failure, especially if the opponent has any monster that can run over your tributes. To show this in perspective, to summon a level 7 monster, we need 2 tributes, and for a level 6 monster, we need 1 tribute. This means just to get the tributes out, we need at least 3 turns. Then, to summon Dark Magician and Dark Magician Girl, we need an extra 2 turns for each normal summon. That's 5 turns minimum to set up for Ragnarok. And that of course is assuming we have Dark Magician and Dark Magician Girl in the hand, and also 3 extra monsters that we can use for tribute fodder. So the next part is the cost, which is removing from play all monsters from your deck, grave, and hand. Obviously, this card is meant for a last resort, and is meant to be one of the final cards you play, given that you're blowing up your deck for the sake of the insane effect. Even if we were to disregard the fact that you're essentially using a crush card virus on steroids on your own deck, the end result of all this effort is your opponent's monsters are destroyed, not even a full board wipe. This means you're still susceptible to forms of disruption, such as a rogue mirror force, and if the opponent manages to live the turn and go on to destroy your 2 Dark Magician cards, you pretty much end up losing with no monsters left. This card is a victim of the anime creating cards for specific instances and exaggerating their effect.
As it literally notes on his show card, just based on the card he's shown, destroy and remove from play all cards your opponent controls. So that'll be all cards on the field. Naturally, the card texts weren't really refined back in old Yu-Gi-Oh, but effectively it gives you a free attack with 1 monster or 2 monsters because it's Dark Magician Girl and Dark Magician. But yeah, just to clarify that.
And if the opponent manages to live the turn and go on to destroy your 2 Dark Magician cards, you pretty much end up losing with no monsters left. This card is a victim of the anime creating cards for specific instances and exaggerating their effects so they can be a lot cooler when being used. There really isn't any design reason for every monster being balanced, apart from it being a cool visual of every monster joining in and an attack against them. As for the traps, despite not quite hitting the highs of cards like Card of Sanctity, I think for once the lineup of cards chosen aren't actually awful, with a few exceptions. Great notable additions like Magic Cylinder, which can help control tempo and battle protection, Soul Rope, which serve many purposes like providing a tribute fodder for the next turn, or even adding that missing magnet warrior you need. Mystical Ref Panel, which provides protection, albeit weak, from almost any spell card, or Life Shaver, which is just downright broken in the slower format, where duels go for 10 plus rounds. So Life Shaver becomes a ticking time bomb that can single-handedly win a duel by making your opponent lose heavy card advantage. We also even have great generic staples, like Dust Tornado, which provides the deck's one and only way of spell or trap removal, or Magic Jammer and 7 Tools of the Bandit, which are counter cards to traps and spells respectively. As for the other traps, despite there being a couple duds like Chain Destruction, which is way too niche to provide any utility, other than if you're facing off against a rare hunter with 3 copies of Exodia. For once, the cards that Yugi has chosen aren't completely awful. Now per the Battle City rules, every time a duelist would win a duel, they would obtain the rarest card out of the opponent's deck. So out of the 9 Battle City sanctioned one-on-one duels, he gets 5 new cards: Red Eyes Black Dragon, Arcanus Dark Magician, Slifer, Obelisk, and Ra. So out of these 5 cards that he gets, he gives back Red Eyes to Joey, and is never shown using Arcanus Dark Magician, presumably because the card was illegally altered. In anime, the god cards were hyped up as game-altering monsters, where if you manage to get one onto the board, you're pretty much guaranteed victory. And by going off of their anime effects, it's not really a surprise why. They are all immune to pretty much everything, so spells, traps, and monster effects don't work on them, until they do. To add on to that, they each have their own broken effects. Slifer is a walking floodgate, which can destroy any monster with 2000 or less attack, effectively stopping your opponent from making any plays. Obelisk can raise his attack to infinity, or cause 4000 burn damage, it's not really clear, at a cost of 2 other monsters. And Ra, well, so now it's more clear how broken the god cards are. What do these 3 additions bring for Yugi's deck? Well, for one, they bring a clear win condition and a lot of power to the deck, due to how broken they are, and pretty much just mean that if you get them onto the field, it pretty much wins you the duel. But the only problem, and it is a big problem, is that you require 3 tribute summons, so that itself is hard enough to get. This wouldn't be as big of a deal if it wasn't for the fact that Yugi's deck just isn't set up to reliably swarm the field with monsters for tribute summons. You have cards like Valkyrion, which can be pseudo-contact fused out to summon 3 Magnet Warriors, but we've already talked about how awful the requirements for even getting Valkyrion onto the board, or the King, Queen, Jack Knight combo, which itself is also pretty unreliable. As it stands, the inclusion of the god cards end up just being bricks most of the time, and give the deck even more dead draws. Ultimately, if we look at the cards in the deck individually, yes, they are an improvement over the cards in Duelist Kingdom, with an increase in power of monsters like Big Shield Gardener, Buster Blader, and God cards, or an improved spell and trap lineup, with powerful cards like Card of Sanctity or Magic Cylinder. The main issue that comes with the deck is the lack of cohesion, and how the deck just contains so many bricks. The deck suffers from a lot of dead hands, due to the presence of spells being restricted to only Dark Magician spellcasters, which there are only 2 of in the deck, and that the balance between tribute summonable monsters and normal summon monsters are just out of proportion. 3 out of 10.
The disrespect of Yugi's deck. But to me,
don't miss out on the fantastic
the disrespect of Yugi's deck. I'm like, a lot of these decks, especially the Battle City later half, in my opinion, it is a case that he side decked them in. So it makes sense why they're in the deck, because he needed that extra level of power in order to defeat stronger opponents, i.e. Kaiba with Obelisk and Merrick with the Wind Dragon of Ra. So obviously he's considered the costs and benefits of including a deck, and clearly there was a right option doing so. Naturally, this is my own headcanon, because ultimately, at the end of the day, the writers will always choose enjoyability than over the most like precise plays. And for me, I can appreciate that, because at the end of the day, we enjoy it. We want these hype moments, we want spectacles, we want crazy last minute pulls. There's nothing wrong with that. Especially how some of the ways they depicted Kaiba losing against Diffusion Wave Motion will always be a special moment to me. Especially because Kaiba vs Yugi is the longest duel in the entire show, coming up to 6 episodes long. You do have to end that kind of episode with a bang. Then also against Merrick, the whole how they like depicted Obelisk and Slifer like completely like choke holding Raw and then taking him out away. That was an incredible moment. It's a beautiful spectacle where it gives you a satisfying payoff to a essentially nearly like an 80 episode arc. I'll always be able to appreciate that more than if he had the most perfectly tactics used and whatnot. No, because the thing about Yu-Gi-Oh is it's not your traditional shonen like where you have like your beam struggles with Dragon Ball Z, or like you have a last minute like Rasengan or Chidori clash. You have to use fighting in a more artistic way to battle out and show the conflict of people's battles. And these last minute moments are the truest hype around it. As to me, they're equally as momentous and equally as grandiose as maybe like a final spirit bomb against Boo, or a father son Kamehameha from like Gohan against Cell. It's on the same level. You need payoff, you need spectacle. And I'll always appreciate Yu-Gi-Oh for that, as it gave me some of my most memorable and iconic moments from watching anime and watching Yu-Gi-Oh growing up. But I'd love to hear from you guys. What would you say is your favorite moment in Yu-Gi-Oh? And what do you think are the most iconic moments in anime? I will see if I can do videos on all of them. But I'd love to hear your thoughts down below. But as always, thank you for watching, and ciao till next time.